Before I carry on, I just want to dedicate this to Malcolm Tate, who suddenly passed away a few weeks ago. Malcolm was head of department at Urban Studies and Planning whilst I was doing this research, this postdoc on squatting. And I always remember him being a very kind, supportive and friendly man, which is very rare in academia. So I just want to say thanks to him for supporting me all those years ago. Next slide, please. You want it? Yep. So it's early morning in Camden, North London, and we're on outreach with Streets Kitchen. A small group of us follow Carrie, who knows the best route through the borough for finding people who had slept rough the night before. Behind us, we're towing a beaten up cart with water, juice, tea, coffee, breakfast bags of donated food, hard-boiled eggs with smiley faces drawn on them, sun cream, spare socks, and information leaflets about local services and organisations. Every time we spot a body or a tent, we pull up and check whether or not they've woken up. If they are awake, we offer them breakfast. And Carrie starts waving a wand, creating bubbles in the air which refract the light into rainbows. The bubbles appear, they fill the space for a moment, simultaneously located and dislocated, centralised and decentralised, unbounded. They are briefly visible before they dissipate, always being moved along, some floating out of view, others exploding on London's hostile environment. We reach Camden Tube Station and Carrie creates even more bubbles than before, signalling that Streets Kitchen have arrived. Bodies gather, they pause for a moment before disappearing in different directions. Individually, each body is a precarious sphere, but collectively they create their own short-lived atmosphere. With each wave of the wand, Carrie creates temporary solidarity, belonging and joy, a spatial presence without any clear boundaries. And yet London is hostile to these fragile bodies. The city has been known to burst membranes and break the skin. The city pushes them to move along and disperse, blowing them down the street, preventing them from ever sustaining a collective presence. Carrie tells us that she adds sugar to the bubble mixture as it helps to sustain the spheres as they bounce and deflect off of London's hard surfaces and spiky architectures. As people gather at our cart, we add sugar to their tea. We pass out food, we chat, and aesthetic presence is created in the city. Later on, Carrie drew this mental sketch map. We did an interview about that outreach, and the first thing she did was marked out all the bubbles in yellow. They're very simple, the bubbles, she says. It's their own language. Everyone can connect. There's something very playful about the bubbles. It brings you back to that childhood feeling. For me, they're a language. They bring smiles. I don't know. Why do you smile when you see a bubble? Everybody does. Carrie's map is the story of our outreach that morning, and she decides to draw the route in a non-linear spiral fashion, allowing the different moments and atmospheres to layer on top of one another. The bubbles signal what's going on, she says. It makes the invisible visible. Everyone needs to see what's going on. People are not invisible. They're not. They're here. As the layers build up on the map, Carrie recalls story after story in different spaces, sometimes laughing, sometimes with tears in her eyes. As the map becomes illegible, there's a sense of being overwhelmed at the scale and chaos of those on the sharp end of criminalisation on London streets. That morning, we had stopped for 98 people in just a few hours. In a final flourish, Carrie scrawls across the map, "Fuck Starmer." Next slide, please. So what I'm sharing today is effectively the train of thought that I've been on for about the last 10 years. So the first half of this talk will be an entanglement of different projects, little fragments from different bits of work that I've done. And I'm hoping that together they will bring together some themes, which I think have already been brought up today in multiple papers. They've now led me to what I want to do next, which is on overexposure. Next slide. So for those of you interested in methods and approaches, most of my work is ethnographic in style, so I do things like participant observation, going on outreach like the one with Streets Kitchen that I just mentioned, Also visiting places like squats and kind of protests and things like that. I use interviews, I use photos, and I use archives as part of that kind of ethnographic approach. I've also used a load of other methods as well. And what I think is quite interesting is the kind of, when you're dealing with these kind of vulnerable and marginalised communities, is some of the pushback that you get, whether you're using kind of standard ethnographic methods or trying to be more creative. So one example of this is that picture you can see there. We visited a gypsy traveller family who are living roadside on the outskirts of Leeds. And quite often when families receive eviction papers, they won't read them. They just think like, okay, we've got the eviction notice, they'll probably be here in a couple of weeks, we'll just move on before then. So the mother of this family basically said to us, well, I'm not going to read it, you can have it. She handed over the core papers to me and the co-researcher. And we're like, oh, okay, fine. And before we could even say anything about it, her daughter, who was about, I'd say 7 or 8, ripped the letter from my hand, tore it up and threw it over a fence and said, try reading it now. And there was something I think said earlier about these kind of little acts of refusal as a kind of protection, as a kind of ethical conundrum that kind of pushes us to think about our position in that space. I've also used these kind of methods to try and deal with that and kind of try to decenter the researcher in the narrative. So I used photo elicitation methods when I was doing the squatting research. And this is basically handing out disposable cameras to squatters, try and capture their space, and then interview them about it. And you'll see some photos in this presentation. But the other one that I've already introduced is this mental sketch mapping, which was a new method for me in the Narrow Margins project. Now, this in itself I found to be a really great approach. It allowed for a lot of freedom for the participants to kind of describe spaces and different events that happen within those spaces. But we also encountered some troubles with this. So one of the organisations we were working with said, you'll never get adults doing this, you'll never get adults colouring in, like what a silly thing to do. They actually loved it in the end. You also get a lot of self-doubt, so people saying, oh, I'm not very good at drawing, I'm not very artistic, I don't know, is this what you're after? And then you just do like a quick mapping, like, yeah, that's brilliant. But really it's more about the kind of process of drawing the map than creating a piece of art. And there's also an issue of surveillance. So particularly when I was working with people sleeping rough in London, we were asking them to draw maps of different parts of London or different spaces that they'd encountered police or encountered security guards and trouble with the public and things like this. And basically one person said to me outright, oh, you want to find out where people are sleeping. So there's this other problem of whether it acts as a kind of surveillance. And that's something which we're kind of still trying to work through in terms of publishing this stuff. Okay, next slide, please. So this is from my research on squatting in London. This was a building that was squatted in 2018 during a particularly bad patch of cold weather called the Beast from the East. So I'm just going to read you a bit from that now. So whether through negotiation or through a crowbar, Streets Kitchen find ways to access disused spaces for setting up refuges and solidarity hubs. By doing so, in the context of widespread homelessness and vacant buildings across London, they also politicise these spaces. In March 2018, facing the possibility of widespread deaths across the streets of London, they responded by squatting Sophia House, an empty commercial building on Great Portland Street. An unseasonal weather front dubbed the Beast from the East saw heavy snow and icy winds sweep across the UK. Temperatures in London struggled to climb above minus 14 degrees, prompting a red snow warning and a possible risk to life. And yet the response from local authorities was inconsistent and patchy. The idea behind SWEPs, which are severe weather emergency protocols, is to coordinate a citywide response to provide emergency shelter when there's extreme weather. And yet there's always a reluctance, it seems, to announce SWEP too early. A combination of public funding cuts through austerity and different political ideologies or empathies towards the homeless also means that the availability of shelters varies massively across London, depending on which local authority you find yourself in. What's more, shelters just aren't suitable for everybody. Some hate the feeling of being confined. Others distrust the state and fear giving over their personal details, which might expose their whereabouts to family members or reveal their migration status in a hostile environment. The omnipresent St. Mungos had come under heavy criticism at the time for reporting people they were working with to the Home Office, whilst other bigger, more corporate charities are seen as often disempowering service users who must play the part of a desperate victim to be considered a suitable candidate for support. This is why Streets Kitchen adopts the slogan, solidarity, not charity. So Sophia House, which was squatted during a snowstorm, stood in clear contrast to those cold and inhospitable streets, but also the half-hearted, slow, and often alienating response of the state and the third sector. By just doing it, squatters make the question of how we match homeless people with peopleless homes simple. Their occupation clearly demonstrates the contradictions of space and property in London. This is a quote: "You've got people sleeping outside empty buildings. This is ridiculous. People should be in those buildings, even if it was only temporary. The perspective I'm coming from is to end rough sleeping overnight. Once we have those people into a safe space, we can work with them, we can have support services around it, but the primary thing we need is buildings, and the buildings are there." End of quote. So as squatters, the people who set up this space, the volunteer crew, had no more ownership over the space than the people who were coming to stay there. This meant they had no more formal authority than anyone else to say who could or could not be in that space. Although this isn't to say that hierarchies weren't there, of course there were, but the potential is there for people to have a more inclusive use of the building. The reason that the building managed to stay some kind of working over these 3 weeks is that everyone had a stake to keep it viable. And materially, there was also enough space across the 3 floors that people could find somewhere for themselves without encroaching too much on others. Sophia House became more than simply a shelter for 200 people to survive in a snowstorm. Compared to the emergency SWEP shelters reluctantly opened by the state, this was a location for care and a location for solidarity. Over the 3 weeks, 12 people were admitted to hospital with life-threatening conditions, whilst a further 50 to 60 were medically treated. Streets Kitchen were also able to pool and make accessible valuable resources, including food, clothes, and a bunch of new sleeping bags that were donated by Susan Sarandon. Yet the impending eviction and the constant media scrutiny of the squat was a constant reminder of how the wider property model would eventually render the space precarious and temporary. Next slide, please. So one of the main things that I talk about in this book is this tension between property use and property ownership. And then what this tells us about entitlement in the city, who is considered to be a legitimate user or a legitimate use of urban spaces. So the ownership model, on the one hand, the ownership model of property, which you can read about through like Nick Blomley's work, for example, calcifies property. It shuts down any possibility of competing claims to a space. By using formalizing technologies such as titles and registers and surveys, on the one hand, but then on the other hand, using the law to criminalise anyone who trespasses and kind of challenges that ownership of the space. So property ownership in this way also carries with it normative ideas of who can or cannot be a legitimate owner or user of the city. In contrast, squatters are trespassers. So by definition, they're not able to base their claim on a space through ownership, through title, or through registers. Therefore, they have to negotiate use on the ground. They have to negotiate it with one another. Now, that's not to romanticize that. This is not always free of hierarchy. It's not always free of exclusion. It's not always free of violence. But the point is that there's a possibility there for a negotiation of use in the space, one which would be shut down by an owner, by a formal owner. Because what the state does when there's someone trespassing onto a property is they say, right, let's go and find the owner. They can tell us whether this person can or cannot use the space. So in this way, I kind of argue in the book that trespass tells us something about property and it tells us something about the city. It's a kind of window onto these property relations. Trespass and squatting interrogates property and forces that ownership model to reassert itself. It says, come on then, if you want to kind of, put your stake in the ground, put your boundary down, you're going to have to evict us. So it reveals the absurdity of that system around it that keeps so many buildings empty, which are needed in a housing crisis. And it challenges those preconceived ideas of entitlement, of who gets to be in the city and to what ends they can use urban space. Next slide, please. So after the squatting project finished in 2020, and I went and got a job at Burgum City Uni, then a couple of years later I managed to get some funding through the ESRC new investigators to kind of pick up on some of these ideas. And what I wanted to look at is that relationship between the formalisation of property and the criminalisation of trespass. And I wanted to do this with people who were in public spaces. This was in the context of a police act that came in 2022 that tried very hard to criminalise trespass. And they tried to do it by focusing on roadside gypsy and traveller families. So what I did with this project was focused on two groups, gypsy and traveller families in Leeds and rough sleepers in London, thinking about how property was managing and controlling their use of public space. So this is a story from Leeds. Imogen is 35 years old. She identifies as Romany gypsy and English traveller, but she uses this interchangeably and also shortens it to the term traveller. Up until the age of 18, she lived roadside, so their family home was a group of caravans, which they didn't park on formal sites. Instead, they searched for spaces on the peripheries of cities and towns where they might be able to pull up and stay for a reasonable length of time. The ability to travel is both a cultural tradition and a fundamental part of Imogen's identity. Being nomadic is part of the social, cultural, and economic infrastructure of being a traveller, facilitating connections with family and friends, maintaining a sense of self and a sense of common identity against a wider society of racist hostility. So while they are travellers by name and nature, it's property norms that have made their life more and more difficult. And this has become harder to find places to stop, keeping people moving along. So this is one of Imogen's mental sketch maps. So despite constant apologies that her drawing just wasn't good enough, it didn't matter, because every time Imogen drew a line or a curve across the page, she was sparking new memories and new information that she could share. The map is processual, it's never complete. And through the sketch, she is talking a story and revealing how travellers experience the contingency of property in practice. And this is a quote during that interview. They're scared. Even if they're not being moved on yet, they know it's coming. The kids are like, no, we can't play. The police will be here any minute to kick us off. We can't come out and play, we have to pack up. It's heartbreaking for the kids. They live in fear. Where are we going to wake up tomorrow? Are we going to eat tomorrow? We can't feed the family if our dad hasn't had a chance to go out and work. End of quote. Whenever we tagged along with Leadsgate to go on outreach to these different sites, it was often the children who were the first to confront us in those spaces. Usually they'd be outside playing whilst their parents were either doing housework or out earning an income. And the kids would spot you coming from a mile off and they'd run over and straight away they'd be asking, are you the bailiffs? Imogen explained further, the kids, they don't go to school, they don't get to see anyone from outside their community, they don't get anybody approaching them and saying, do you want to play? They get people walking past and going, oh, the gypsy's stopping, I wonder how much rubbish they're going to leave. They're constantly getting harassed and bullied from people outside of the community. In contrast, Imogen had some fond memories from when she was a child, and the specific sites where they've been able to stay roadside for extended periods of time, and were able to return to multiple times a year. The joy of this particular space that she was mapping is that they got to stay there more than anywhere else, literally 3 or 4 days at a time. And when they were on their way to stay there, they knew they could remain on the site for as long as they needed to, without fear of being moved along. So they would return to the same spot maybe once a month, and the locals would say, oh, you're back, we've missed you. It was the only place where she really felt accepted by anyone else. being able to stay paved the way for travellers on the site to build community relationships with non-travellers. She talks about this railway bridge, which I think I've just cut off the map there at the bottom. And then they would sit on this railway bridge and construct friendships with the children who were living on the nearby housing estate. This is a quote. We'd all sit on the bridge and obviously chat about their culture and our culture. They were very intrigued about our culture, just as much as we were intrigued about theirs. They used to come on and play with our dogs or ask for milk and sugar. So even though we were invading that field, we were very accepted by all the people that lived there. If I could go back there right now, I would. So in a context where discrimination against roadside travellers is whipped up by stigmatising and racist discourses, which perpetuate those property norms I was talking about of who is or is not a legitimate user of space, the relative stability of this particular site, which allowed for informal negotiations around use, paved the way for bridging divisions between Imogen's culture and the one around her. Next slide, please. So the Narrow Margins project, we kind of tried to understand this in terms of this squeeze with my co-collaborator, our research assistant, but really co-collaborator, Isabella Pojuna. So on the one hand, you have this criminalisation of trespass, which has assumptions around legitimate and illegitimate uses of space, and also binaries such as settled, unsettled, owner, non-owner, citizen, non-citizen, public and private. And then on the other hand, you have this formalisation, this consolidation of the ownership model of property, and a question of who counts, and the fact that who counts as a legitimate or illegitimate user is not up for negotiation, it's settled in advance. The Police Act in 2022 introduced new powers for police and property owners to move families along. In an unprecedented extension of power, it only had to be the owner or a representative of an owner to ask trespassers to move, and if they refused, they could be liable for arrest. The Act also extended the amount of time where they could not return to the same spot, so keeping people moving along. But after we submitted some research evidence, we actually got this taken out through a court case in the last police bill, which had just come through. So when it comes to property and trespass, sometimes it's not about these specific tools of, a new police power is coming in, a new act has given police new powers to move people along. Actually, what we found through the research is a chilling effect, this kind of accumulation of powers and tools and acts across decades, centuries to move people, keep people moving along. I think I turned it off. So often when families are threatened with legal action, as I mentioned before, they will just move on. They won't go to court. They won't try and challenge it. They'll just accept that they are the trespassers, and therefore, that's it, we've got to go. They don't want to risk their property being confiscated. They don't want to risk their kids being taken into care or their pets being taken off them. So they just move along before the bailiffs get there. Okay, next slide. Is there a map there as well? Okay, there's supposed to be a map there, never mind. So one of the ways we extended this to London, to people rough sleeping in London, was to do these mental sketch maps as walking interviews. So we kind of walk through spaces that they were familiar with, and they tell us about these spaces, moments where they've been approached by police or private security, and they would narrate this to us afterwards through the mapping. So they would literally narrate and draw the walk we've just been on. So this is from a particular walking interview with two guys. So I asked them, do you ever get bothered by the police or security here? And one of the participants said, yes, they'll say, I can't be here. The security will say, I can't be there. I just can't be bothered to argue anymore. Even if I'm in the right, I just keep moving on. And then the other participant added, if you're told to move on, you should. You just move on because you know you're not right. They'll just come and say, look, you're not supposed to be here. This is a public footpath. And they just clear away all your belongings. For those who are sleeping rough or loitering on London's streets, the line delineating public and private property is blurry and unclear. And this allows for private security, police, business owners, and the public to manufacture a mandate to move people along. So I asked them, when someone is being moved along, what does the police or the private security say? Oh, they'll say, you know how it is, the business is open, we apologise. Some of the security guards might apologise, some might go, this is just how it is, you need to move, time to go. It can be pretty random. And it's the demeanour of the individual. I was going to say officers, but they're not, are they? No, they're corporate residence inspectors. So yeah, you could get anything from, I'm really sorry mate, this is just your last night, be gone in the morning, to literally being hassled every half an hour. So I asked whether there was an argument about whether this is public or private space, and therefore whether they should move along because they're trespassing or whether a different set of rules applied. And the first participant said, there'll often be a pushback from the person who doesn't want to move, this is public space. And they'll just say, well, actually, no, it's not, it's private. Because the person doesn't know their rights. Also, it's not clear, and I think that's quite often intentional. Because if you were to explicitly mark out, if you had an overlay of what is or isn't private land, suddenly your friendly map of London would look very different. Next slide, please. The way we try to theorise this is through this idea of Goldilocks zones. So I assume everyone knows the story of Goldilocks. Okay, cool. But in physics, the Goldilocks zone is that space of perfect temperature. So it's not too hot, it's not too cold. It's a zone of inhabitation around a star. So we are currently in a Goldilocks zone at the moment. Maybe not for much longer. But we try to apply this idea to rough sleepers finding spaces in London which are not too hot, not too cold. And we were using that in the sense of exposure to enforcement and surveillance and violence. At this point, we weren't using it in the sense of the weather. So individuals sleeping rough in London have a very intricate knowledge of the urban environment. They know the infrastructures, they know the built environments, where it's best to sleep, where it's not best to sleep. They know jurisdictions of different private security and different police. And they try to find a balance between somewhere which is tucked away enough that you can avoid scrutiny or potential violence from the public or from the police, but also somewhere that isn't too hidden. Because if you're too hidden, then there's no protection from something such as assault. It's a kind of an eyes on the street argument that we need to find the perfect spot where there might be people walking past if something should happen. So as one person tried to explain to me, it's a trade-off between anonymity and security. There's no perfect place because otherwise everyone in London would be there. Everyone finds their niche. Some people like a quiet space, but it's a double-edged sword because it's isolated and you're at risk. So finding Goldilocks zones varies across the city and location plays an important role. As one participant put it, if you come more central into the city, there are more problems with private businesses and private security or police. If you're a little bit on the fringes, there's a bit less of a headache. Such spaces also change depending on different seasons, weathers and times of day or night. One cartographer spoke to us about a church being a safe place to sleep, or the park, but only during the day. He was very wary of sleeping in the parks at night. He also pointed to spaces under a railway bridge where you can find shelter, but there you risk being attacked by drunk people coming out of the pub. You need, this is a quote, you need rain cover, you need visibility, you need security around you, but it depends how vulnerable you are. Some people prefer different things. Security cameras, getting to know security or police. It depends on those individual police and security as well, the personality of the individual. This one person was saying to me, come and stay here, and I was like, that's way too open. But she said, you've got to look at it a different way. The fact that the security is going around means that it's safer. Plus, how many other places are there where you've got a 5-metre overhang? That's the thing, as long as I'm dry, I can always put more layers on if I'm cold, but if I'm absolutely pissed off, I can't dry out quickly. There was one particular example where we spotted a tent which was in the doorway of a shop that had gone bust and was closed. And the participant explained to me how that occupant had been really clever because they're on the threshold of private and public, but they were also between two jurisdictions. So they cleverly positioned it in such a way that the street sweepers aren't going to get it and the drivers aren't going to get it. There's no security cameras on that path, so who's actually taking responsibility? The security don't go down there. It's a little no man's land. it's not covered by Fitzrovia, and it's not covered by Camden. So this idea of Goldilocks zones tries to capture that squeeze between criminalisation and formalisation that I mentioned, but also how life on the narrow margins is actually based on nuanced understandings and grounded knowledges of the city. Part of this is trial and error, so just kind of trying to testing out different spaces in London. But it's also about sharing information with one another, about how, I actually got quite a few nights in that one spot, so that could be useful for you. Okay, next slide. So now we turn very much to the work in progress half of the talk. And this is a concept which all of these kind of projects have led me towards, but also thinking about it, as Rona mentioned, in the context of climate emergency, and particularly heat, and the way in which ever extreme heat events are taking place across the world, but also in the UK. So in Rona's article on limited exposure, he conjured up this image of the way in which elites, those with means, were able to completely socially conceal themselves from the city. So one of the images that sticks in my head is someone living in a penthouse in London could get an elevator, air-conditioned penthouse, could get an elevator down to their armoured car in the basement, drive to the helipad, get a helipad to the airport, get a plane across to the city, do the complete thing in reverse straight up to their penthouse, having never touched the street, having never actually been exposed to the city air and the atmospheres that are around them. And this kind of struck me, like, both in terms of their resources and their access to resources and their privilege and be able to do that, but also, what they're afraid of, what are the perceived risks they have of the city, and kind of what do we mean by exposure? What are these different elements that we're talking about? Is it a fear of crime or violence, or is it actually also to do with weather and climate, the material environment around them? Is it about surveillance and control? And so, building off that, I'm thinking about this idea of there are groups that can limit their exposure, there's groups that are overexposed. If we take overexposure literally, like the actual definition of the word, it's a harmful or undesirable state of being subjected to something. So light, overexposed to light, overexposed to radiation, overexposed to public attention for too long and in excessive amounts. So in photography and film, too much light hits the sensor in the camera, it washes out the colours of the picture, and you lose all the detail. In the environment, we're talking about overexposure in terms of a body being overexposed to extreme weather, perhaps leading to damage on that body. And in the celebrity world, we're talking about being too much in the public eye, so overexposure kind of leads to a public backlash. So how can we take that metaphor? Well, let's think about how vulnerable and marginalised bodies and groups who are facing intersecting inequalities have limited means to reduce their exposure. How are they subjected to the harms of the climate emergency? Next slide. So hopefully I don't need to convince anyone in here that we are in a climate emergency. There's some councils already that are going back on that announcement that we are in a climate emergency. But something that might surprise you is some findings from the Museum of Homelessness in London, who found that more people died rough sleeping in London during the summer months than the winter months. And they blamed inadequate provision. So there's, as I mentioned before, this severe weather emergency protocol, SWEP. It's patchy, it's inconsistent. It's also not a statutory duty for local authorities to act on SWEPs. So whilst the City Hall and the Mayor can announce SWEP whenever they feel like there should be a response, and they've started to directly open up a couple of spaces across the city for emergency shelter, it's actually down to local authorities to decide how they respond and what budget they put towards it. SWEP also only automatically kicks in at 0 degrees Celsius. So there's a kind of imagination that the cold is very bad and dangerous for people sleeping rough, but there's no real imagination around other types of extreme weather. More recently, since this, some councils have started bringing in SWEPs for other extreme weather events, but it's still patchy, it's still inconsistent, and it's still pretty limited. And this idea of saying, like, right, 0 degrees, when it hits 0 degrees, that's the threshold where we need to start helping people. That is what we might call it an environmentally deterministic understanding of climate change, which based vulnerability on a data point rather than how it's landing on different bodies and different spaces in the city. So it's a problematic, this is from Elspeth Opperman's work, it's a problematic assumption that exposure to environmental conditions is the prime determinant of heat risk. Next slide, please. So overexposure, in contrast, is building on this idea that extreme weather events such as heat are a more than meteorological experience. Weather is not just numbers on a weather report. And vulnerability does not just fall from the sky. The damages associated with climate events result more from the conditions on the ground than from climate variability or change. Climate events or trends are transformed into differentiated outcomes by social structures. This is kind of sub-discipline of critical heat studies, and one of the key academics in there is Hampstead, who talks about how thermal measurements and heat management plans are overly technocratic, they're depoliticized, they're ahistorical, and they're narrowly defined as meteorological. And this eclipses the multiple structural dimensions of heat inequity, or what we might call thermopolitics. Next slide, please. So the way in which Beth and I have been trying to break down overexposure as a concept is to try and think about it in these different modes, which intersect and overlap and entangle with one another. So you have this question of like, what is it that actually makes an extreme heat event or extreme weather event extreme? Where and for who? The climate emergency is uneven, we know this, and it's being shaped through an entanglement of different bodies and their kind of structural inequalities, such as health inequalities or access to infrastructure. The built environment, which is not suited to extreme weather events or has not been planned or designed with that in mind. But also, and this is a particular thing that I want to add to this, enforcement. The way in which people are being moved along from spaces means they'll then become overexposed by being pushed out of shelter spaces or being pushed out of parts of the city where they've managed to find some respite from the weather. So these factors intersect and structure the weather, creating public health hazards, exacerbating illness, and causing unnecessary deaths. Next slide, please. So let's start with bodies. This is just a picture I found online which talks about how heat creates compounding effects on your health and the kind of risks to health from heat. And you can't really see, but up in the corner here it says confounding factors: solar radiation, temperature, humidity, and wind. So the only way in which it's being imagined is like this external threat, this external force that just lands universally on everyone and causes this threat. It's not considered how these kind of approaches miss out the visceral experiences of bodies enduring heat, what it actually means for different bodies to endure heat in different locations. So bringing it back down to the level of body means we can think about literally how do people manage to expel heat from their bodies, but also, again, Elspeth Opperman talks about how some bodies, because they have to work, create heat as well, produce heat, so are put into a position where their bodies are even further overexposed. Something that we need to be aware of, however, when we're thinking about the level of bodies, is that observing bodies as a way to know the climate has an expert-led, pathologizing, and racialized colonial history. So Venkat points out how in India there was a shift from centuries-old local knowledges of how to deal with heat to architecture, storing water, and creating inside and outside liminal spaces, to when the British Empire colonized, a medicalized model and a racist science around which bodies could or could not handle heat. So this meant that there was a kind of shift away from self-reported experiences of thermal sensation and instead towards the need for scientists and doctors and meteorologists to interpret that heat on behalf of people. So just calling back to what I was saying during the Goldilocks zones part, we have to kind of recognise people's own knowledges and their own experiences of these spaces in order to counter that kind of top-down, expert-led interpretation of the impact of extreme weather. Next slide. So the second one is the built environment. So how does the built environment exacerbate extreme weather? So we think about climate urbanism. and the intersection of the climate emergency with the city. We might think about how urban heat islands act through the materials that the city is made out of, the lack of vegetation, the production of heat from urban processes, the way in which cities affect rainfall and worsen air pollution. But it's also notable that the impact of extreme weather events is worse in cities with higher inequality. And part of the reason for that is because of greater demands on limited infrastructure, shade, water, aircon and the electricity to power the aircon, nutrition, health and care services. So whilst healthy and wealthy bodies have mechanisms to physiologically or socially get rid of the heat that is landing on them, others don't. So it becomes a matter of access and infrastructure. And urban environments are compromising the ability for bodies to regulate heat. So we need a kind of approach for things about cool infrastructures and cool inclusion within cities, as well as pre-existing health conditions that can exacerbate what's called the heat health burden. I also would argue that you can't really consider the impact of the built environment without also bringing in that wider consideration of urban politics, of enforcement, of control, of property and trespass, which restricts access to cool spaces. So it's a known fact that tree cover and grass is a way to cool down during a heat wave, and yet these are spaces that are over-policed, especially if you're a certain kind of person, a certain kind of, appear to be a certain kind of body. That differential policing of public places becomes a problem. Also the overhangs of a building. So if you're on a path with a building that overhangs you to find shade, are you in public space or are you in private space? And actually it's police and it's private security or the public that can kind of mobilise the idea that that is actually private property and you should move along. So there's no accountability to where that space is. I think also, this is kind of moving on to the next slide now, please, Beth, but there's been a move to extend what counts as nuisance or what counts as antisocial behaviour across a series of police acts under the last government and the current government. And one of the things they're looking to introduce as a public nuisance and antisocial behaviour is smell. So if you imagine if you're a rough sleeper in very hot weather, no access to kind of sanitary facilities, good smell, and that could be actually now seen as antisocial behaviour enough to threaten you with a behaviour order or threaten you to move along. Okay, so the final third of that circle is this idea of enforcement. Now, I use the term enforcement because it's the word that is used by people who are working on the ground. So people like Streets Kitchen, people who are sleeping rough, they will talk about enforcement. And they use that word instead of police, for example, because it's not just the police that are doing this. It's actually a mosaic of different organisations and jurisdictions that are called upon. One of the most surprising ones for me was the Canal and Rivers Trust, who are moving people along from the canals in Camden, because they have a very specific mandate from a piece of legislation in the 1980s that means they're responsible for clearing up the riverbanks and the canal banks. So they use that as leverage to move people along from the canal banks in Camden, where they much prefer, if people were going to be drinking, that they would be tourists. So it's kind of a sense of these different policies and laws and jurisdictions, both formal and informal powers, that all captured under this word of enforcement. Some people in here may have seen recently that the Vagrancy Act from about 200 years ago has been repealed. That took enough campaigning, enough years in itself. But actually it means very little because homelessness is being criminalised in the UK in multiple other ways. Public space protection orders, which bring in that differential policing I mentioned. Who is the public that is considered in need of protection in these spaces? It's not the people who are sleeping or loitering there because they've got nowhere else to go. Community protection notices, which can give very specific behaviour orders. So we know someone who got a CPN in Camden, which banned them from being outside any public building in the borough, which is just impossible to maintain. And then I was mentioning earlier this latest one, which is even broader, which is respect orders. I mean, the language just gets worse and worse, but basically, a respect order can order you to stop behaving in a certain way, but can also order you to start behaving in a certain way and take positive measures to address your behaviour. And if you break the respect order, you are liable for arrest. Now, in a recent article from Simon Marvin, he talks about atmospheric governance. And the way he talks about it is through the selective curation of comfort, which creates geographies of thermal privilege, and that these map closely onto existing divisions of wealth, power, and access. I think this is spot on, but I also think we need to add in these kind of other things that are going on in terms of enforcement and control in public spaces. Because it's not just about how it maps onto bodies and the built environment, it's also how that environment is being controlled and manipulated. Okay, next slide, please. I think as we saw last week, there's a real need for this kind of research. It's imperative that we consolidate a nuanced understanding of heat risk, that we actually use in-depth qualitative data to kind of foreground those structural inequalities, rather than just treat heat events as something that just comes from outside and lands upon us universally and equally. We need a kind of understanding of the ad hoc physicality of the informal built environment. I also think part of this is saying that extreme weather or extreme heat events is not something that's just happening to them or over there or in the future. So a lot of this work has been inspired by the Karachi Urban Lab, where they've had extreme heat events for a very long time now. And part of the kind of discourse around that is like, oh, it's just hot over there. And it kind of feeds back into that colonial narrative, like, oh, that's just kind of what the tropics are like or what that part of the world is like. And actually, there's lots to be learned, there's lessons to be learned, there's foresight, and there's a kind of language that we can draw upon to understand what's happening in multiple cities. And of course, there's the problem that as soon as the extreme weather event ends, it leaves the imagination. So last week, we found out that we missed out on some funding for this research, but we also had a lot of people saying to us, look, it's so important, this research is so important, because everyone was sweaty. And it was, 38 degrees or whatever. But then as the event kind of gets further in your mind, it then becomes less urgent and less prioritized. And I think, especially for policymakers and people trying to think about heat action plans in different cities, this is a real problem. So I think we need this kind of research to address that as well. Okay, just to conclude. Next slide, please. So I started with this idea of property and trespass, which has these built-in normative ideas of entitlement, of who is a legitimate user or use of urban space, and how these ideas of property are being mobilised as tools for differential policing and control in cities. Then in the middle there, I was talking about Goldilocks zones and about how people are being squeezed on the narrow margins, but how they also have grounded knowledges and intricate expertise of the city and urban space. So actually, these are groups that can tell us more about the city than experts say, or like self-confessed experts. And then finally, this idea of overexposure, that the climate emergency is falling unevenly through bodies, built environments, and through enforcement, and it is falling along the lines of existing entangled inequalities. So just a final slide, here's a overexposed picture of a squat. Thanks very much.